Imagine discovering that much of what you believe about yourself, your desires, your relationships, even your sense of purpose, was shaped long before you were aware enough to question it. Not by choice, not by logic, but by invisible forces working quietly beneath the surface of your mind. Most people go their entire lives without ever noticing this. They call it personality. They call it fate. They call it just the way things are. But philosophy has always existed to challenge that blindness, and no philosopher was more dangerous to comfortable illusions than Socrates. Socrates didn't write books. He didn't preach doctrines. He didn't give people answers they could memorize and repeat. Instead, he did something far more unsettling. He asked questions that dismantled identities, questions that forced people to confront not what they claimed to believe, but why they believed it in the first place. He understood something most people still resist today. The greatest prison is not built from walls, but from unexamined assumptions. We walk around convinced we are choosing our lives freely, yet rarely stop to ask where our choices come from, why certain people attract us, why certain fears dominate us, why certain patterns repeat themselves no matter how many times we swear, this time will be different. Socrates called this state ignorance, but not the innocent kind. This was ignorance disguised as certainty, and certainty, to him, was the most dangerous illusion of all. Because when you believe you already understand yourself, growth becomes impossible. Now consider this. What if some of the strongest forces shaping your life operate in silence? Not through control, not through command, but through influence so subtle you mistake it for your own will. Ancient philosophers understood this well. They observed that power does not always announce itself. In fact, the most effective forms of power rarely do. They move quietly, shaping decisions, emotions, and perceptions while remaining unseen. That's why Socrates paid attention not just to laws and politics, but to psychology. Long before the word even existed, he noticed how people were driven by desires they didn't understand, fears they couldn't name, and roles they inherited without consent. He noticed how men especially were taught to perform strength while remaining deeply unaware of their inner conflicts. And here's where things become uncomfortable, because the moment you begin to examine these hidden forces, you realize something unsettling. Much of what you chase in the world is compensation. Compensation for uncertainty. Compensation for insecurity. Compensation for parts of yourself that were never acknowledged or integrated. You chase achievement to feel worthy. You chase approval to feel safe. You chase connection to feel whole. But chasing is not the same as understanding. Socrates believed that most suffering comes not from lack, but from confusion, from mistaking symbols for substance, from confusing validation with meaning, attraction with truth, noise with fulfillment. That's why he famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living," not as an insult, but as a warning. Because when you don't examine your inner world, it doesn't stay neutral. It governs you. Modern psychology would later echo this idea, explaining how unconscious patterns drive behavior until they are brought into awareness. But Socrates already knew this intuitively. He saw how people defended beliefs that harmed them, how they clung to identities that limited them, how they confused familiarity with truth. And perhaps most importantly, he understood that real transformation does not begin with changing the world. It begins with confronting yourself. This is why his method was so threatening. He didn't attack people directly. He didn't accuse. He asked questions. And those questions did something terrifying. They removed excuses. When you are forced to articulate why you want what you want, why you fear what you fear, why you repeat the same cycles, you can no longer pretend it's all accidental. you begin to see the architecture of your own mind. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This is also why most people resist philosophy, not because it's difficult, but because it's destabilizing. It threatens the narratives that keep us comfortable, the stories we tell ourselves to avoid responsibility for our inner lives. But Socrates didn't believe comfort was the goal. He believed clarity was. And clarity, while liberating, is never gentle at first. Because clarity reveals where you've been living unconsciously, where you've been reacting instead of choosing, where you've been performing instead of being present. It shows you that many of your struggles are not imposed on you. They are reinforced by you, not intentionally, not maliciously, but habitually. And habits of the mind are the hardest to break. This is why Socrates focused so intensely on self-knowledge, not self-esteem, not self-image, but self-awareness. He knew that without awareness, intelligence becomes cleverness in service of illusion. Ambition becomes escape, desire becomes distraction, and worst of all, relationships become battlegrounds, where unresolved inner conflicts play out endlessly. Think about how often people say they want truth, but react defensively when it appears. How often they say they want freedom, but cling to routines that keep them predictable. How often they say they want depth, but avoid silence where depth actually emerges. Socrates would simply ask, "What are you afraid to see?" Because fear is the guardian of unconsciousness. And once you begin questioning fear, once you stop running from discomfort, something changes. The noise quiets, the compulsions loosen, the patterns become visible. You begin to realize that wisdom is not about collecting answers. It's about removing false certainty. And that process, slow, uncomfortable, honest, is where real power begins. Not power over others, power over your own attention, your reactions, your inner direction. This is only the beginning. Because once you learn how unseen forces shape your inner world, you start noticing how they operate in relationships, attraction, conflict, and desire. You start recognizing that much of what feels external is actually internalized long ago, and that realization changes how you move through the world. In the next session, we'll go deeper into this unseen architecture, exploring how silence, influence, and emotional intelligence shape human dynamics far more than dominance or force ever could. But for now, let this question sit with you. How much of your life is chosen, and how much is inherited unconsciously? If this session made you pause, reflect, or see yourself a little more clearly, like the video, it helps this kind of thinking reach people who are ready to question deeper. Once you begin to see how unseen forces shape your inner world, something strange happens. You can no longer unsee them. Moments that once felt random start revealing patterns. Emotional reactions that once felt justified begin to look automatic. You start noticing how often your life is guided not by conscious choice, but by impulses formed long before you had the language to question them. This is where philosophy stops being abstract and becomes dangerous, because awareness doesn't just illuminate truth, it disrupts comfort. Socrates understood that most people don't resist truth because it's false. They resist it because it threatens the identity they've built around not knowing, an identity constructed from habits, roles, expectations, and silent agreements with the world. Agreements like, this is just who I am, this is how life works, this is what I want. But once those agreements are questioned, stability dissolves. And here's the paradox. What feels like loss at first, is actually the beginning of freedom. Most people believe power comes from control, over circumstances, over outcomes, over other people. But Socrates saw something deeper. He saw that the person who cannot govern their inner reactions will always be governed by the world. This is why emotional intelligence mattered more to him than status or authority, because emotions, when left unconscious, don't disappear. They direct behavior from behind the scenes. They shape attraction, resentment, attachment, and fear without ever asking permission. Think about how often people say they are calm while living in constant tension, or how often they claim independence while being driven by the need for validation, or how often they say they want honesty while avoiding self-reflection. Socrates would gently dismantle these contradictions, not to humiliate, but to awaken. He knew that silence itself could be revealing, that what people avoid saying often matters more than what they proclaim confidently, that pauses, hesitations, and defensiveness expose the real structure of belief. And this is where many people become uncomfortable, because silence forces confrontation. When noise fades, there is nowhere to hide from your own patterns. Modern life is designed to prevent this confrontation. Endless distraction, endless stimulation, endless commentary, anything to keep attention outward so it never turns inward. But Socrates operated differently. He slowed conversations down. He asked simple questions and waited. He allowed discomfort to linger. He let people sit with uncertainty until clarity emerged, not from him, but from within them. And what often emerged was this realization: I've been living on borrowed beliefs. Beliefs about success, beliefs about relationships, beliefs about what gives life meaning, beliefs absorbed from parents who were themselves confused, from cultures that reward appearance over substance, from systems that benefit when people don't question their desires. Once you notice this, a deeper question arises. If so much of what you want was shaped unconsciously, what would you want if you were truly awake? This question changes everything, because it exposes how much of human behavior is compensatory. We don't chase things because they fulfill us. We chase them because they temporarily quiet an internal discomfort. Achievement becomes a way to avoid feeling insignificant. Control becomes a way to avoid uncertainty. Attachment becomes a way to avoid loneliness. But avoidance is not resolution. Socrates believed that confronting discomfort was not weakness. It was discipline, a form of inner strength far rarer than physical dominance or social authority. He knew that a person who can sit with uncertainty without immediately escaping it develops clarity. And clarity leads to self-mastery. This is why he valued dialogue over debate. Debate seeks victory. Dialogue seeks truth. Victory inflates the ego. Truth dissolves it. And dissolution is precisely what most people fear. Because ego offers structure, identity, familiarity, but it also traps. It keeps you repeating what you already know, reacting how you always have, defending a version of yourself that no longer fits. When Socrates asked people to define concepts like justice, love, or virtue, he wasn't interested in textbook answers. He wanted to see whether their lives aligned with their words, and often they didn't. That mismatch between belief and behavior is where inner conflict lives. We say we value honesty, yet avoid uncomfortable truths. We say we want growth, yet resist change. We say we seek freedom, yet cling to routines that numb us. Socrates didn't shame people for this. He exposed it, because exposure creates choice, and choice is the foundation of freedom. This is also where relationships begin to change. When you become aware of your inner patterns, you start seeing how often interactions are driven by projection rather than presence. How often people respond not to who is in front of them, but to unresolved experiences from the past. Misunderstandings multiply not because people are malicious, but because they are unconscious. Socrates understood that when awareness increases, blame decreases. You stop seeing others as enemies or saviors and start seeing them as mirrors. Mirrors reflecting your triggers, your expectations, your unhealed attachments, and this can feel destabilizing. Because once you stop blaming the world, responsibility returns to you. You can no longer say, "This just happens to me." You have to ask, "Why does this keep happening through me?" This question is the threshold most people never cross, because crossing it means giving up victimhood, giving up the comfort of externalizing pain, giving up the illusion that fulfillment lies somewhere outside your awareness. But those who cross it discover something rare. They discover inner stillness, not passivity, not indifference, but grounded presence, a state where reactions slow down, where emotions are felt but not obeyed blindly, where attention becomes deliberate rather than scattered. This is the state Socrates lived from, and it terrified authority, because a person who governs themselves cannot be easily manipulated. They are not ruled by fear, flattery, or false promises. They see through surface narratives. They ask better questions. They move differently. This is why Socrates was sentenced to death, not because he corrupted minds, but because he freed them. And here's the truth most people avoid. Freedom is not granted. It is claimed internally. No system can give it to you. No relationship can supply it. No achievement can secure it. It emerges when you see clearly enough to stop living unconsciously. And once that process begins, it doesn't stop at the individual level. It transforms how you relate to others, how you interpret silence, how you perceive influence, attraction, and emotional power. That's where we're going next. Because in the final session, we confront the most uncomfortable realization of all, that awakening does not make life easier. It makes it more honest, and honesty demands courage. If you're ready to continue this journey deeper, subscribe to the channel. What comes next is not for everyone, but it's for those willing to see clearly. Everything you've heard so far has been preparation, a slow dismantling of the invisible structures that shape how you think, desire, react, and choose, often without your awareness. But now, we reach the point where philosophy stops being something you listen to and becomes something you must live, because awareness has consequences. Once you see clearly, you're no longer innocent. You can no longer pretend you didn't notice the patterns. You can no longer blame confusion on fate or other people. And you can no longer escape into distraction without feeling the quiet tension of self-betrayal. This is the cost of awakening. Socrates understood this better than anyone. He knew that wisdom doesn't make life comfortable. It makes it honest, and honesty removes excuses. Most people want clarity only until it demands responsibility. They want insight without change, truth without disruption, freedom without discomfort. But real understanding never works that way. Once you recognize how unconscious forces have been directing your life, a choice appears. You either return to sleep, deliberately this time, or you step forward into responsibility. And responsibility is frightening, because it means admitting that much of your suffering has been sustained, not imposed. That many of your conflicts persist because they serve an unconscious need. That many of your attachments exist, not because they nourish you, but because they protect you from facing emptiness. This realization doesn't shame you. It empowers you, because what is sustained can be transformed. Socrates believed that most people live as if they are actors trapped inside scripts they never chose. Scripts about success, masculinity, love, purpose, scripts reinforced by culture, rewarded by conformity, and defended by fear. But when you see the script, you're no longer bound by it. You may still feel its pull, but you're no longer compelled. And that distinction changes everything. This is where inner sovereignty begins. Not dominance, not control, but presence. Presence is the ability to remain conscious in moments where you used to react automatically, to feel emotion without becoming it, to experience desire without being consumed by it, to encounter conflict without collapsing or attacking. Presence is rare because it cannot be faked. It emerges only when you've faced your own shadows honestly, without justification, without performance. This is why awakening often feels lonely at first, because the world is loud with unconsciousness, loud with distraction, loud with certainty built on unexamined beliefs. When you begin to live with awareness, you stop resonating with that noise. You start noticing how often conversations avoid depth, how often people confuse confidence with clarity, how often connection is replaced by performance. And for a while, this can feel isolating. But isolation is not the final stage. Integration is. Socrates never intended people to withdraw from life. He intended them to engage with it consciously, to move through the world awake rather than reactive. Awareness does not remove struggle, it refines it. You still feel fear, you still feel desire, you still feel uncertainty. But these experiences no longer dominate you, they inform you, and that shift from domination to dialogue is the essence of wisdom. When you live this way, relationships change. You stop needing others to complete you. You stop using connection to escape yourself. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You begin to meet people as they are, not as symbols of unmet needs. This doesn't make relationships easier. It makes them real, and reality is demanding. It requires boundaries. It requires patience. It requires the courage to walk away from what no longer aligns, even when it's familiar. Socrates would say this is the price of integrity, to live in alignment with what you see, not what you wish were true. And here is the final truth most people never hear. Awakening is not about becoming superior to others. It's about becoming responsible for yourself. The awakened person does not seek to convince. They don't preach. They don't need validation. Their presence speaks quietly through how they live, how they listen, how they respond. They don't rush to fill silence. They don't fear uncertainty. They don't confuse movement with progress. They choose deliberately. And because of that, their lives begin to feel internally coherent, even when circumstances are difficult. This coherence is peace, not the absence of chaos, but the ability to remain centered within it. Socrates drank the hemlock calmly, not because he wanted to die, but because he refused to betray his awareness to preserve comfort. He chose truth over survival. That level of integrity is rare, and no one asks you to imitate it dramatically, but you are asked to live it quietly, in how you speak, in how you choose, in how you confront yourself when no one is watching. Awakening does not announce itself. It shows up in restraint, in clarity, in the refusal to live unconsciously anymore. And once you reach this point, the question is no longer philosophical. It is personal. What will you do with what you now see? Will you return to old patterns, knowing what they cost? Or will you accept the discomfort of growth in exchange for inner freedom? There is no judgment in either choice, only consequence. Because once awareness arrives, life begins responding differently, and so do you. If this series made you reflect, challenge yourself, or see something you hadn't seen before, share your thoughts in the comments. Not for agreement, but for dialogue. That's where philosophy truly lives.